In tabletop RPGs, there are these weird alien humanoid races. Your mind flayers and your doppelgangers come to mind, but also lizardfolk, troglodytes, kobolds, maybe goblinkin or orcs or trolls if you treat those differently. Anything that has a different understanding from the stock races that your players come to the game with a preconception of. Like elves, dwarves, halflings. Do you bother to think about these as anything other than just an antagonist? Do you give them a different way of thinking about things, or are they just evil by virtue of being evil? I'm James, this is DM with a Day Job, and today we're going to be talking about the Lizardfolk as an example of how we portray these kind of alien races in Dungeons and Dragons, and whether we should even bother. I'm doing this partially because a few episodes back, I mentioned that Lizardfolk had stolen a relic from a Temple of Tyr, and maybe if the players got that back, the priest would be willing to cast a resurrection for the party, and that kind of put me on the hook for it, at least in my head. That's a me thing. And I've also done an adventure like this, two of them, one where the dungeon was really good, didn't have Lizardfolk in it, but the players had a blast, and I had a blast running the dungeon, but the enemies were just kind of there because it was a random cave. I felt like that was a waste of a dungeon afterwards. It wasn't a super story plot. On the other side, I did a dungeon where I had a lot of fun playing the Lizardfolk and the dragon at the end of it, but the dungeon wasn't so great. So I mushed them together and put together a new adventure for you folks, because you're getting the second draft. It's down there in the doobly-doo. You can grab it, download, and use it. I'm trying a new thing with the layout with an online tool from the home brewery to make it better. Let me know what you think about it. If you like this kind of stuff, if you like this kind of content and you appreciate it, then I appreciate it if you give it a like and a sub. That helps out a lot. There's, broadly speaking, three ways to think about this kind of thing. The orcs are evil because they're evil. We don't have to think about this. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli don't have to feel bad about all the orcs they put in the ground. The orcs are evil, full stop. No, the orcs aren't evil because they're evil. They're evil because Sauron and Morgoth are evil, and they are enforcing their will on the orcs. The orcs are subjugated. If you took the orcs out of that circumstance and had them raised by, I don't know, a gnome, then they'd be perfectly reasonable. They'd be members of a functional society, maybe. So it's not that they're evil by nature, they're evil by nurture. The orcs aren't evil, they are different. They were created by a different being than the other races, dwarves, elves, halflings, and humans, so they do not see the world in the same way. Sure, you could take one out and have it raised by gnomes, but it would still fundamentally be an orc, and it would understand the world through a different lens. Yes, being judged by these halflings and dwarves and whatever, they would see it as evil, but it's not necessarily that. Just have different ethics and different morality that is not compatible with the other races in Middle Earth. And those incompatibilities can only be solved through conflict. All these options have their plus sides and downsides. If you say that orcs are evil because they're evil, that's fine, until one of the players says that I want to play an orc that is the exception of the rule, the orc that is good. If you care about the verisimilitude of your world, then all of a sudden you have to come up with a reason why that exception exists for that player, or you have to tell them no, they cannot do that because the orc is fundamentally evil. So you're going to have to do a bit of tap dancing. If your players care about that, and if you care about it. If you don't, then you just go on your merry way, and who cares what this Yahoo on the internet is saying about morality and orcs and lizardfolk. On the other hand, if you're going to say that morality and ethics and good and evil comes from the society that you're in and everyone can be redeemed, you're setting up a system where every player has to question every person that they're killing, whether they're good or evil, and they have to figure out whether that's morally justified in their situation, or they don't care, in which case you as a dungeon master who's trying to set that up might become disappointed with the fact that they don't seem to respect your world. You might need to come up with something that is a acceptable substitute for that. Often that is demons, devils, or undead. Undead can just be slaughtered without worrying about them because they're not alive, they are dead. But then you're stuck always dealing with undead, devils, or demons, and that can be very limiting. The third way, coming up with an alien race, is a lot of work. You got to come up with how this race thinks. What are its base needs? And how would that shape their society, their beliefs, their religions, their social structures? And how are the players going to relate to it on their terms? How are they going to come to some sort of meeting of the minds if they can negotiate, if that's even possible? Then there's also that if it's too alien, it's hard for the players to kind of hook into it and understand it on the player's terms. They're going to need some explanation, and that can get very preachy, and you maybe not want to do that. What if the player wants to play one of these things? Is their idea of how a lizard folk should behave different from yours? And are they really representing your species in your game? The player playing it is usually the exemplar for how other players think that species should behave in your world. That's usually why I reserve that kind of thing for the very alien species, things that I don't think my players are going to play. Something like an ettercap or a mind flayer or a troll or lizardfolk, kobold, troglodyte, something they may not want to play, or I'm not going to let them play in the case of the mind flayer or the troll, because no, you cannot play a mind flayer or a troll that's really into knitting because they're just too powerful. It's not fair. No, you cannot do that, which is fine if that's what you want to do, but you are limiting them. Lizardfolk are one of the species that I would present as alien to my players, because they are. They're reptilian rather than mammalian, and that means that they would have a slightly different pyramid of priorities, pyramid of needs, than a mammalian like a human or an elf or a dwarf. And that would reflect in their culture. Take, for example, societies. Humans have societies for a number of reasons, but chief among them is the need to care for our young. Our young are pretty helpless until about 10 plus years old. If we need to go hunt gazelle or deer or antelope or whatever it is, our young are a liability. We can't bring them with us, so we have to leave them behind. But at the same time, that means that they're vulnerable to jackals or coyotes or dingoes or whatever the predator is. So it'd be really helpful if we had some other humans around to guard our young while we're off farming or hunting or doing whatever we have to do. So we congregate as a species to make sure that we can protect them. But lizards don't have that problem. Lizard children are operational shortly after birth. They can go flee another predator, they can hunt, they can escape into the sea. Think about turtles. They bury their young in the sand and then they're out. Our parental duties went as far as burying you in the sand before birth and then we're out. Good luck, you're on your own. It is not out of the ordinary for reptiles to eat their young. They're not alone in this. It's just not strange among that group of animals because there's no family unit. There's very few reptiles that form any sort of collective pack or do anything as a group. So reptiles are generally solo creatures. And that means that they are not used to having any sort of family bonds. They don't have attachments to one another. I think lizard folk would have a society in a fantasy RPG, but they're forced into it by the mammal creatures. Because mammals tend to congregate in societies, I'm at a disadvantage. I, as a lizard folk, am capable of defending myself against 2 or 3 villagers. That's not a problem. But there aren't 2 or 3 villagers. These things breed like rabbits, so there's 20, 30 of these things all over the place, and they're driving me to extinction. So I have to band together with others lizard folk to survive. But it's odd for us. We don't know how to operate like that instinctually. The same way that humans don't instinctually understand odds. If you ever had somebody say, "How did I fail?" when they had like an 80% success rate and they're very surprised that somehow they failed, you still had a 20% failure rate. What do you mean, how did you fail? There's a chance. It's right there. But it doesn't enter into our consciousness that way. We don't think of it in those terms because math is not natural to us. It's something that we've developed and we can get very good at it. I am not one of those people. But we don't instinctually understand it. And the same thing would be true of lizard folk in societies. So they wouldn't have a natural cohesion among themselves. They might be perfectly happy to make some sort of alliance with halflings or dwarves or elves against their other lizard folk because they don't feel any familial bond between the lizard folk. That's what makes them neutral. They don't hate other lizard folk. They don't like them either. They might betray them, but not out of malice, and they wouldn't help them out of a sense of empathy. They're helping them out of self-preservation. So they are neutral because they're not doing out of good or evil. They're not doing out of law or chaos. They're forced into the society where they have to depend on one another, but they don't really value one another, nor do they hate one another. So they're neutral. Going back to our pyramid of needs, there's one more thing that we can, I guess, exploit to make our species feel more alien to our players so they don't completely understand where they come from and they don't meet each other on the same terms. And that's the base needs. Humans, among our base needs, are food, water, and shelter. And certainly the lizardfolk share two of those. They need food and water. But they don't necessarily need shelter, certainly not as much as a human does, because they have scales. They're not as susceptible to weather effects as a humanoid is. But they do have a different need. They need heat in a way that mammalian creatures do not. Because if I don't have heat, I will become catatonic. If I become catatonic, I cannot find water, I cannot hunt, I can't do anything else. So heat becomes the underlying thing for anything in a reptilian race, like our lizard folk. Then it all of a sudden becomes understandable why they might subject themselves to rule by like a salamander king or a red dragon or a fire elemental or fire giants, anything that can provide them with heat and some way to keep warm and stay alive, they'd put up with. We as humans will put up with an awful lot if our shelter, if our food, if our water is put in jeopardy. What would you be willing to put up with if not being warm was a death sentence for you? You'd put up with a lot. So you might live with a red dragon, even though the red dragon is eating lizard folk. I don't really care about Ben and Sally. It's a shame that they were eaten, but I'm still alive and I'm warm. And as soon as that base need is met, then I can go look for other circumstances and try to better the rest of my life. But I need this. If I don't have this, I don't have anything. I think one of the pop culture series that does this best is Star Trek. I base my orcs off the Klingons because I like Klingons. I like Michael Dorn's portrayal of Worf, and I really like all the Klingons in Deep Space Nine and what he did with it there. General Martok is my personal favorite. There's the Borg. If you need a hive species, you're going to have some sort of intelligent ant. You want cranium rats, or you have Formians from the neutral plane of Mechanus or wherever they're from. You can use the Borg as a basis. Bees and ants are hive species. If they become intelligent, they become intelligent as a kind of collective intelligence rather than as an individual. Yeah, they have queens and ant colonies and bee colonies, but they're still fundamentally serving the hive. So they have this one creature that is different, that the hive depends on, but it doesn't know itself as different than anything else. That can be super interesting as a disposable enemy. There can be no reasoning between the Federation or the Klingons or Romulans and the Borg because they're not driven by the same needs. They don't want individuality. They don't have that idea the same way that the humans, Romulans, and the Klingons do. If I was portraying the Illithids, I'd probably treat them like the later stage Borg, where they do have a queen, and that's the hive mind. Any mind flare that you interact with, any Illithid, is going to be very much just brains or assimilate kind of thing until you get to the hive mind, in which case that thing has a personality and a want and a need. In our next episode, we're going to start talking about how we make different boss monsters, and I want to give you some examples of like things that you can give to your boss monsters to use them. We're going to use some of the bosses that I made for my Ravenloft campaign, which is wrapping up this weekend. They have their fight against Strahd, so I'll have Strahd in there as well as how I did one of the players and converted them to a legendary hero, how I made Baba Lysaga, how I made a couple of the other people, and give you some examples of some that worked really well and some that were bad, and some thoughts I have on boss monsters. And then long term, we're going to start talking about a proper town, not a village, maybe not like a full metropolitan city, but a small sized city that our players may come to think of as their home base. There's lots of opportunities for adventure. So if you've got thoughts on things that you'd like to see in a city, things that you'd like to explore, things that you thought would be neat that you might want to see tackled, put them down in the description. I can't promise that I will take them all, but I'm interested to hear what people think hasn't been covered or that they would like more details. Or look, I had a lot of problems with how I get people to wander into a sewer, or how I portray a thieves guild that my thief guild player doesn't immediately try to assassinate the leader and take over, or how do I run magic shops and whether I should or not, and that kind of thing. So start cooking and put it down there, and I'll see what I can do to incorporate at least some of it. Until next time, Dungeon Masters, remember, you are a player too. Try to have some fun.